Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Governor of Bank Indonesia, Bapak Peri Warjio. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Janger Contemporary Dance.
Dia cuma 3 menit.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. A very warm welcome, a very special welcome to Your Excellencies, Governor of Bank Indonesia, Bapak Peri Warjio. Deputy Secretary General of the Financial Stability Board, Mr. Rupert Thon. Vice Chairman of ASEAN Standard Chartered Bank, Bapak Rino. And of course, Director of Finance Sector Hub of United Nations Development Program, UNDP, Mr. Marcos Neto, who joined us virtually for today. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to High Level Seminar, The Role of Central Bank in Aligning Climate Transition, ASEAN Matters, Epicentrum of Growth, here in Bali, Nusa Dua Convention Center, 30th of March 2023. My name is Nadira Titalia, and it is my greatest pleasure to welcome all of you today. Ladies and gentlemen, you just saw a dance, Janger Contemporary Dance. It is a dance that a creation of art adopted from the traditional Balinese dance carries traditional values into the modern world. The dance represents transition and collaboration to achieve sustainable economic growth as ASEAN is working towards the epicentrum of growth. Distinguished guests, before we start the session, firstly we will have the keynote speech delivered by Governor of Bank Indonesia. Bapak Periwarjo, the stage is yours.
Very good morning to all of you, my dear fellow governors, deputy governor delegates from the ASEAN finance minister and central bank governors meeting today. And of course, first of all, I would like to also welcome all of the distinguished speakers that present here. We have Mr. Rupert Ton from the FSB. We have Pak Rino Dono Saputra from the Standard Chart, as well as on the virtual, we have Marcus Neto joining us, and of course, our moderator, that moderated the second the session is Kania. And all of you that present here, as well as that presenting also viewing this seminar on virtual. We just see the Janger dance number 28. You don't believe, right? There is 27 Janger dance that coming back from probably back in the old days, because Janger dance in Bali is one of the oldest dances. My recollection, there is already 27 creation of Janger from around this Bali island. Every culture, every era develop the dances. Why number 28? Because if you see this Janger number 28 represent that we will discussing today, which is the issue of the world today, which is not only about digitalization, but also green and inclusive economic. After we are surviving for 3 years pandemic. So you notice why our dancer not holding the digital right, but also bringing the green and inclusive. This is what we have discussing today. Let me just giving you some early thought. Why discussing about green and sustainable finance, especially aligning policy for climate transition, is very important. And why the central bank must also involve. And why under Indonesia chairmanship of ASEAN 2023 bring this, the third pillar of our team, ASEAN Matter Epicentrum of Growth. The aligning policy for climate transition. After 3 years of COVID, we learn, and actually we have been trained to be green as well as sustainable and eco-friendly. This is very important because when we talk about the impacts of climate change and nature degradation are bigger than the threat of the pandemic themselves. Will have substantial negative economic and social consequences if not dealt with accordingly and anticipated early. The magnitude of the impact could be severe and costly. Under the current trajectory, the global GDP could be 11 to 14% lower by mid-century than in a world without climate change. So if we can address the climate change, actually we can avoid the degradation of this. And we can lift up the world GDP by 11 to 14%. If we can completely avoid the climate change degradation. If we can meet the Paris Agreement, Actually, we can afford the degradation about 4% in GDP by mid-century. This is a lot of money. This is a lot of economic and social impact as well as for the inclusive economy and growth in our world. This is the reason why Indonesia bring this climate and sustainable economic development becoming the third pillar in our team. Remember, one is rebuilding recovery, second is digital economy, the third pillar on the finance track is transition toward climate change. This is very important. But then the question is that how we have to do that? How we can advance our agenda on the climate transition toward much more green and inclusive economy. Of course, there are three important aspects. One, strong policy and political will from the authorities. There is no way that we can bring advanced climate agenda without strong political will. And this is the purpose why Indonesia bring this, the third pillar, to cement and to make stronger the political will of the ASEAN member state for advancing climate agenda. Number two, clear framework for the transition, including also clear framework for moving forward the finance framework. Because at the end of the day, the finance is very important. Clear framework for implementing climate transition agenda. Number three, the success will also depend on how much we can mobilize the finance. Even though the strong political will there, even though we can formulate the clear framework for the transition, the mobilization of capital is very important. Because at the end of the day, moving the transition agenda need a capital, need new investment, which is more green, more eco, more, of course, inclusive project. Knowing that this project can be financed only by public capital. And this is why this seminar becoming important. And this is why Indonesia bring this is the third pillar under the finance track of the ASEAN 2023. To cement, to stronger the political will of the ASEAN member state, let's move forward climate agenda. Second, sharing and of course have technical assistance on developing the clear framework for climate transition. And the third is how we actually can mobilize the capital. Of course, my dear fellow three speakers will discuss this, the political will, developing the framework, and especially on mobilizing the finance. We have the lineup of the three prominent speakers that can share this aspect. Let me just share my preliminary thought on this. First, of course, on the strong political will. The climate transition should be supported by sound policy framework for orderly, just and affordable transition. Of course, with due consideration to different country circumstances, because different countries have different state of development, problem of the climate, as well as also capacity to move forward. It is imperative for the relative authorities to work together in dealing with socio-economic impact from the transition. Authorities also need to build partnership with the private sector to mobilize climate financing and to scale up the investment. So this is the first aspect that we need to discuss in today. So we can also bring this issue to the finance minister and central bank governors meeting. So we count on the three speakers to discuss this issue. The sound policy framework that we can elevate to the minister and governor to be cementing strong political will of the authorities in ASEAN and the world. Second, how this seminar can also bring about recommendation for giving clear guidance the implementation of the transition finance framework. This is important, the clear transition on the finance framework to guide the development of the policy as well as on the financial service to support the climate-related transition. Last year under Indonesia presidency G20 2022, we thanks G20, especially Sustainable Finance Working Group that come up with the development of set of high-level principles for transition finance. I do believe the work of G20, Sustainable Finance Working Group, the high-level principle can be as a reference for ASEAN to developing and giving clear guidance in the implementation of the transition finance framework. On those principles, there are a number of important issues that I do believe this session will discuss further. Among others, identification of transitional activities and investment, reporting information and transition activities, developing transition-related finance instrument, designing policy measures, as well as assessing and mitigating negative social economic impact of transition activity and investment. Those number two. Number three, the role of central bank. The role of central bank becoming important not only to promote, not only to advocate, but also to support the implementation of the transition, especially the transition of finance. Global initiative also working on that route. We have central bank governors on the greening of finance. On that group, we discuss how the role of central bank in initiating, promoting, as well as supporting the transition finance. This is also the commitment of Bank Indonesia. We are strongly committed joining the government, joining the private to move toward sustainable development goal. Many that we already issue from the Bank Indonesia. One, we issue already macro-prudential policy that supporting green and sustainable development, including also giving incentive for the bank that providing finance to the green project. And incentive in terms of additional liquidity, including also we issue 100% loan-to-value ratio for bank that financing the green project. Second, we also giving technical assistance and capacity building through the workshop on preparation and financing of green project to local governments. Through our 46 branches throughout the country, we advising the local government, including here in Bali province. I just got report from my director, my chair of Bank Indonesia Bali, just accompanying the governor of Bali province, a meeting with World Bank, representative of Indonesia to discuss the green project, how the preparation. We are advising on those of preparation, those will important. Grant facilitation. Bank Indonesia is also exploring the possibility of channeling a grant from multilateral institution to a bank they're interested in issuing green bond. The grant could be in the form of technical and also financial assistance to help institutions obtain green certificate. Investment strategy. In line with the BI overall policy, we also adopting sustainable and responsible investment SRI strategy and our foreign exchange management. We invest our foreign exchange reserve in asset which is conformable in the green and sustainable finance. In this respect, we also have a portfolio in sustainable sector and the use of sustainable Sharia compliant bond sukuk. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's hear the three speakers that will discuss more clearly. This is the intention of Indonesia to advance this agenda and the third pillar of the finance track toward the green transition of the economy. Cementing the strong political will of the member state, formulating clear transition of the finance framework, as well as also supporting the central bank in moving forward the green and economic finance. With that, let's start the seminar, and hopefully the seminar will give fruitful discussion and recommendation for us. I thank you.
Thank you, Bapak. Please remain on stage, Pak, as we will have a group photo session. And I would like to also invite, kindly remain on stage, Pak. All right. All speakers and moderators, please join us on stage for a group photo session. And I would also like to invite, if you can see Mr. Marcos Neto, if you're here, please turn on your camera, sir. All right, thank you very much. All speakers and moderator, Mr. Rupert, Bapak Dino, and our moderator, Ms. Kania, and Mr. Marcos. Please allow me to count backwards in 3, 2, 1. Once again in 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much. You may return to your seat, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, today's high-level seminar will have a very interesting topic as we will discuss macroeconomic impact on climate transition while fostering central bank policy framework in dealing with climate change and understanding while mitigating the risks. Distinguished guests, the ASEAN 2023 recognized the importance of addressing climate issues as the seminar holds a platform to share insights, experience, and best practices from our speakers in dealing with challenges and also leveraging opportunities to promote sustainable finance. All right, without further ado, let us give a warm welcome to our moderator. She is a notable Indonesian journalist, Ms. Kania Sutisna Winata.
Hello, a very good morning indeed. How are you, excellencies, distinguished delegates, and ladies and gentlemen joining us here this morning? I hope everyone is doing very well. My name is Kania Sutisna Winata. It's again a pleasure for me to be here to moderate this next session that we are going to discuss, which are aligning policies for climate transition. And as the governor already mentioned in the beginning, and also the MC before this, saying that this is one of the important issues that is going to be discussed under Indonesia's ASEAN chairmanship, especially because sustainability is also one of the priority economic deliverables that is going to be achieved through Indonesia's ASEAN chairmanship. And for this, I would like to invite our panel to discuss this very important issue. To please join me on stage. Please welcome. We have Mr. Rupert Thorne, Deputy Secretary General, FSB. Mr. Rino Dono Suputro, CEO Standard Chartered Bank, Indonesia EU ASEAN Business Council, and also joining us online, Mr. Marcos Neto, Director at UNDP. A big round of applause, please, ladies and gentlemen, for our speaker. It's a pleasure to have you with us this morning. I hope everyone is doing well. I know we are in Bali. And we're going to have more time, after this to go to the beach and see some sightseeing, But now, going back to our topic this morning, I would like to perhaps give a brief introduction to our topic this morning. And I would like my introduction this morning to start with a definition of climate change. So climate change refers to long-term shift in temperature and weather patterns mainly caused by human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels that already cause severe loss in many countries due to environmental disaster and extreme weather. And given its geographical location and other factors, including high dependency on sensitive climate sector, ASEAN member states are highly vulnerable to climate change. And in this context, ASEAN countries have shown strong commitment both in nurturing actions to address climate change and in promoting sustainable finance to support energy transition into lower carbon emission, among others. But is that enough? That is the question. So what more can we do to support climate transition? What are the challenges? And how do we align policies that can contribute to climate change goals while also supporting a sustainable economy for the future? So for this, I'm going to let, of course, my panel fill you in on the details according to their background and perspective. I will give about 10 to 15 minutes each to our panelists to present their materials, and before we continue with a discussion. So first to speak, next to me is Mr. Rupert Thorne, Deputy Secretary General of Financial Stability Board, or FSB. He will be covering on his presentation how to ensure financial stability to support orderly, just, and affordable transition. And before you start, Mr. Thorne, let me just read a brief reminder of your background so everybody gets to know you better. In his current position, Mr. Rupert Thorne helps in the FSB's work to coordinate international policy initiatives to strengthen the financial system and promote consistent implementation across sectors and across countries. He has been in this position at the FSB since 2009, and from 2005 to 2008 was in the secretariat of the FSB's predecessor, the Financial Stability Forum. And before then, he had worked in the IMF for 11 years in areas of multilateral surveillance of mature financial markets and debt management policy advice. And previously, he spent over a decade at the Bank of England, mostly in operational areas such as money market operations, government debt issuance, and foreign exchange reserves management. So that's that, and that's a really, really tall order. Mr. Thorne, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's really good to be here today. And thank you to ASEAN, to Bank Indonesia, and Governor Perry for inviting me to speak today. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you about how supporting an orderly climate transition and financial stability go hand in hand, and the FSB's role in this process. Because these are two very closely related subjects. Financial stability is a general precondition for a stable transition to net zero, and vice versa. A well-planned transition based on sound risk management contributes to financial stability. So I'm going to focus in my remarks on the subject of financial risks, as this is the part of the work that's within the FSB's mandate, we're the Financial Stability Board after all. And I hope this will complement the remarks of my other panelists who will talk, I think, more about some of the areas such as the financing of the transition and where the money is going to come from. So I have a slide presentation. Next slide, please. The structure of my remarks will be as follows. First, I'll make some broad points about the financial stability implications of climate change. Then I'll move on to the FSB's roadmap on climate-related financial risks as a coordination structure for addressing the risks. And finally, I'll say a few words about our new work or to consider the links between transition plans and financial stability. Next slide. So events over the last year have demonstrated that policy action to address climate risks is more urgent than ever. The increased frequency of extreme climate-related events, the level of global temperatures last year, and the intense debate about energy policies in many jurisdictions have highlighted that the physical and transition risks are not just a long-term issue or tail event. These are risks that are with us already today. And these risks are important not just to individual firms, but to the system as a whole. Physical climate shocks or a disorderly transition to a low-carbon economy could have destabilizing effects on the financial system. And these risks may be amplified by the financial system across borders and across sectors, for instance, through the cross-exposures of different institutions, the concentration of risks, or sudden withdrawals of capital flows. Effective action relies on strong international coordination, and that's why the FSB developed in 2021 the roadmap for addressing financial risks from climate, which was endorsed by the G20. It's not just a map for the FSB's own work, it coordinates actions across standard-setting bodies and other international organizations in this area, and it's been designed very explicitly to complement the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which we'll hear about from Marcos shortly. Next slide, please. So our roadmap sets out actions over a multi-year period in 4 key policy areas. Disclosures, data, vulnerabilities analysis, and regulatory and supervisory approaches. The G20 asked the FSB to deliver in July 2022 the first annual progress report on our roadmap. That report not only took stock of progress in that first year of the roadmap, it also identified and addressed areas requiring further attention. After all, the roadmap is a living document, as we're all learning in this journey. But we did find encouraging progress has been made across all 4 blocks, which I'll go into shortly. But we need to recognize that the understanding of the financial risks arising from climate change and the appropriate policy approaches remains at an early stage. I'll now briefly describe the progress in each of these blocks. Next slide, please. Block 1 is firm-level disclosures. The aim here is to achieve globally consistent, comparable, and decision-useful public disclosures by firms of their climate-related financial risks. Work in this area has moved forward rapidly in recent years. A milestone was the publication last year by the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB, of 2 exposure drafts on climate and general sustainability-related disclosure standards. The final version, following this public exposure of these global baseline standards, is due in June this year, ready for market adoption. And IOSCO, the securities regulator standard setter, is providing important support by reviewing those standards with the objective to consider endorsement for use by member market authorities. And we hope jurisdictions around the world will then take early action to adopt these new international standards. And sectoral standard-setting bodies are reviewing their own standards for supervisory and regulatory disclosure requirements, such as the Basel Committee's Pillar 3 disclosures, to be consistent with the ISSB's new disclosure standards. I'm pleased to say that the ISSB work builds on the recommendations by the FSB's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which developed principles in 2015. Initially on a voluntary basis, that have now been used as the basis for the new standards. And in the meantime, firms and jurisdictions have already been making steady progress in the adoption of climate-related disclosures and requirements based on this framework. Next slide. Block 2 is on data more generally. Work has continued on improving the availability and cross-border comparability of climate data more broadly. And for data to be meaningful, it needs to be accessible and comparable across different jurisdictions with their different circumstances, as Governor Perry said, including the emerging markets and the challenges they face. To facilitate this, the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, has established a data directory of available climate data sources. We've been working with Central Bank and others to identify those data sources that can readily already be used for computing metrics for our own internal vulnerabilities analysis, and we're partnering with the IMF, amongst others. The IMF has a new data gaps initiative with a focus on climate. There's much that still needs to be done to make higher quality data available, including here in emerging markets. In addition to the NGFS data directory, it'll be important to establish data repositories that provide open access around the world to data in a consistent form across sectors and jurisdictions. And the focus of the future work should be to develop forward-looking metrics. And scenario analyses are crucial here. The NGFS in 2022 released a third vintage of reference scenarios for use by central banks, supervisors and financial institutions. And we issued a joint report with them last November to draw lessons from the analysis so far. Next slide, please. Block 3 is on vulnerabilities analysis, making use of that data to understand the nature of climate vulnerabilities. This work is continuing to strengthen. The FSB is using the data to identify areas, for instance, of current concern and associated metrics to be integrated into our own regular global vulnerabilities monitoring, and our financial institutions are doing the same at their own level. Alongside this, other conceptual work on developing and using monitoring frameworks is continuing. The IMF and World Bank are conducting climate risk analyses throughout the world through their financial sector assessment programs to help member countries better understand potential pressure points in their financial systems. Although the development of these analytical tools is still at really quite an early stage, it's important that we all begin to use these tools that are available today to incorporate into our overall regular financial risk monitoring alongside the more traditional conjunctural risks that we're looking at. To begin with, we may be needing to deal with some of these issues in a qualitative rather than quantitative way, given the continuing data gaps, but we need to make a start down that journey. And the use of the NGFS climate scenarios that I mentioned can help monitoring of these risks account for a longer time horizons and more uncertain outcomes that climate-related risks may involve. Next slide, please. And that brings me to the fourth block, regulatory and supervisory practices and tools, taking action based on the analysis and data I mentioned in the first 3 blocks. Individual standard setters, the NGFS have been developing supervisory guidance covering the banking, insurance and asset management sectors. We in the FSB issued a report last October on cross-sectoral supervisory and regulatory approaches. And going forward, financial authorities should continue to embed the supervision of climate-related risks into their overall day-to-day supervisory frameworks using the scenario analysis that I mentioned, as well as other tools. Financial institutions themselves will be needing to embed climate risks into their day-to-day practices and are doing so already, including embedding them into strategy, governance, processes and controls. They need to make sure that they have the resources to devote to this work and make sure it flows down to decision-making in frontline business functions. As part of this work, the development by firms of transition plans and their use by supervisors is an area of growing importance. And so that's the last area I want to come to here. Next slide, please. Looking at the FSB's work on transition plans. So as ever, our focus is on the financial stability aspects. We plan an initial exercise this year to understand the approaches that are being taken or envisaged by our member authorities for using transition plans for financial stability and macroprudential purposes. These are not the only uses of transition plans, but they're the uses that are important for our work. We're going to be trying to reach a conceptual understanding of how transition plans could interact with financial stability risks with climate change. What do I mean by that? So there could be effects on the financial system from the actions that firms take as part of their transition plans. Those effects could be smooth or they could be disruptive. Are the transition plans as a whole simply to withdraw funding and retreat from the market? Or are they also going to be channeling sufficient funds to climate mitigation and adaptation? This is very important for the climate. It happens to be also important for financial stability. Another way we need to understand the interaction with financial stability is if there's simply a lack of information out there about transition plans, or there are inconsistencies in the assumptions that are being made. Are the plans collectively realistic for reaching our climate goals? Or if they're not, does that mean there's going to need to be an abrupt change of plans later, which will affect the climate and, by the way, financial stability? In our work also, we're going to be identifying how the information contained in transition plans can help provide a forward-looking system-wide perspective on vulnerabilities and understand how they can also inform the scenario analysis I talked about earlier. So I just finished with one last thought. Globally consistent transition plans and globally consistent scenario analysis can help us avoid the unintended consequences that we're all concerned about, especially in regions such as this. So those are my opening remarks. I look forward to the discussion later.
Very well. Thank you for that, Mr. Thorne. We're going to follow up with some questions later on during our discussion, but let's move on to our next speaker to give his presentation. I'd like to greet Mr. Marcos Neto, Director at UNDP, who is joining us from Thailand. He is joining us online. Mr. Neto, how are you?
I am very good. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, I can hear you very well. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Before I give you the floor, Mr. Neto, I'd like to maybe perhaps read a short bio of you so that everyone knows your background and your expertise. So Mr. Marcos Neto is Director of UNDP Sustainable Finance Hub, having a long career of more than 25 years, working in development finance and private sector development. Mr. Neto leads UNDP's sustainable finance approach and its implementation in over 140 countries in collaboration with sister UN agencies and partners. And Mr. Neto also co-chairs the executive boards of the Business Call to Action and the Connecting Business Initiative. And he is also the head of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group Secretariat. And apart from his role at UNDP, Mr. Neto also serves on the supervisory board of CARE International. Mr. Neto, a lot of roles, but talk to us more about, specifically in relation to our topic this morning, on securing sustainable financing for emerging and developing countries. What's the latest development on that? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, accept my apologies and my pain on not being able to be back in Bali. I had a fantastic time traveling to Bali a few times next year for the G20, and it's great to see Governor Perry, and thanks for the Indonesians to invite me today. You know, if I can start by saying, what would it take and how can ASEAN secure sustainable finance? The Asian Pacific region expected to need 1.5 trillion in annual investments across the energy, health, transport, water, and technology sectors to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Now, the main source of capital is still capital markets. Yet, according to the World Bank, sustainable debt markets remain a small fraction of conventional debt in ASEAN, accounting for 2.5% of total debt in 2021. Similar patterns emerge in private equity financing, where funding for climate and clean technologies represents 0.57% of total private equity in the ASEAN during 2017-2021. And in insurance, to both corporate and retail clients, which is notably absent from the offering of financial institutions. There is also a sizable gap in sustainable finance for SMEs. To secure sustainable finance, to achieve an orderly transition to net zero, and reallocate capital towards SDGs, ASEAN leaders need to capitalize on Indonesia's leadership and advocacy of the sustainable finance agenda at the G20 last year to show their commitment to supporting and financing the green agenda. Investors are seeking policy reforms to enable SDG finance, particularly within the energy sector. ASEAN has made significant progress in developing a climate finance policy architecture, but it must now focus on implementation. The ASEAN Sustainable and Responsible Fund Standards, Green Bond Standards, and Taxonomy, which will soon include a 3-tier traffic light system, are crucial tools to design an hospitable investment and regulatory climate that meets investors interested for green investments. This is key to attract international support and external investment to reduce some of the financial burden and risk that comes with developing and scaling new technologies and implementing innovative financial structures to climate finance and all SDG projects. However, this has to be backed by a set of policy and tools. For example, Indonesia's energy transition mechanism country platform is an example of a strong interplay between private and public providers to accelerate coal overcapacity and to getting out of coal fleets early in retirement, which can carve room for more renewables in Indonesia's energy sector. Organizing this transition and organizing the policy reform towards the transition is very important. We at UNDP, again, working with Indonesia and Thailand and other countries in the region, have been putting forward the integrated national financial frameworks, which are basically financing strategies for the policy plans of governments. An assessment of ASEAN members' progress towards the SDGs revealed a rise in greenhouse gas emissions in various Southeast Asian countries, each with its unique GHG emissions profile. Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam's emissions from electricity and heat contributing 31 to 35%. Deforestation and land use changes account for nearly 50% of greenhouse gas emissions in Indonesia, while agriculture contributes 25% in the Philippines. As a result, countries risk having their investments becoming stranded assets due to high CO2 emitting firms, deforestation activities, and tightened regulations. These risks can be mitigated by designing a comprehensive and appropriate policy reforms towards that transition pathways, which is what we're trying to do with the integrated national financial frameworks and the financing strategies. Referring to ASEAN Green Bond Standards, we UNDP are very proud to have supported with thematic bond issues in Indonesia on its Green Sukuk and recently last year on its SDG bond. Supporting project, we can support project selections, data collection processes, impact measurement methodologies and guidance, as well as providing capacity assessments. Through UNDP's SDG investments map, the market intelligence tool supporting organizations to direct capital to where it is most needed, we can help identify impact opportunities where the transition can take place. Ultimately, the effectiveness of the tools mentioned above depend on the data that Rupert, and it's great to see him as well, was measuring, it was talking about. If we don't have the necessary data, it will be very difficult to maintain a continuous process of impact measurement of the transitions to know if we are getting to the right places while we are mobilizing the resources. Now, I want to pick up on governance parity issues on the G20 and Indonesia's leadership last year on the transition finance framework. We believe that a transition finance framework can provide a strong organizing ways by which the transition can take place. The transition finance had 5 areas: the identification of transition activities and investments. And again, if you don't know what are the activities that are going to be that need to transition, will be very difficult to attract the investments. Reporting on information of these activities and investments, developing transition-related financial instruments. There's interesting conversations about, transition bonds, design policy measures in assessing and mitigating the negative socioeconomic impacts of transition activities investments. That's particularly relevant because as we transition to a decarbonized world, parts of the economy are going to lose. What do we do with those unintended consequences? How do we reskew the populations that are working one part of the economy that needs to move to another part of the economy? How to provide that support is also incredibly important. The underlying principles of this transition finance framework include the recommendation to introduce a transition-focused taxonomy and establishing clear recommendations around the verification of transition activities. The framework has been designed to guide the future development of both the jurisdiction policies and financial services strategies to support the net zero transition. This transition finance framework is an integral part of the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which, as Rupert mentioned, is implemented in strong coordination with the FSB roadmap. If implemented, this framework can improve the ability of sectors or firms to gain access to financing to support the transition to net zero emissions. This, in turn, could help them mitigate the potential negative effects of a disorderly transition, such as climate-related transition risk, restricted access to affordable and reliable energy, unemployment, and potential broader social impacts. Importantly, the Sustainable Finance Working Group recommended to put in place taxonomies and to link it up to the disclosure of transition plans. The development of transition financing instruments together with incentives, improving the bankability of transition activities. And lastly, setting eligibility criteria and reporting framework to assess and mitigate potential impacts. This year in the India G20 and the Sustainable Finance Working Group, we are focusing on de-risking mechanisms. Recognition that to emerging market economies, it's still the cost of capital, as the Indonesian president's focus last year in terms of affordability, is too high. And there is a need to move beyond existing blended finance mechanisms towards something that is more systematically in terms of de-risking sovereign bonds and de-risking large portfolios so private capital can flow to our countries towards the financing of these transitions. I'm going to stay here now and turn it over to you and come back with the questions. I hope this is helpful. Thank you.
For that, Mr. Neto, and you know, he ended on quite the perfect note because he talked about how the private sector can help in making the flow of sustainable financing more available, especially in emerging countries. Now, to speak next is Mr. Rino Dono Suputro, also known as Pak Doni, CEO Standard Chartered Bank, Indonesia, EU, ASEAN Business Council, who will perhaps give us an overview on this, on transition finance from the market perspective. We've heard the regulatory side of things. From the market perspective, what has been the demand like? What are some of the issues that is being discussed in the industry? But before you do that, can I perhaps just read a very short bio of yours? Mr. Rino Dono Suputro is the current Vice Chairman for ASEAN at Standard Chartered Bank, who's responsible for driving execution of the bank's ASEAN strategy and providing governance oversight over Standard Chartered's footprints that spans across all 10 ASEAN countries. And prior to this, he held the role as CEO for Standard Chartered Bank Indonesia between 2016 to 2019, marking the first Indonesian to hold this post in the bank's 160 years operations in the country. And with that, the floor is yours, Pak Doni.
Thank you, Makania. And first of all, I just would like to thank the Governor for the invite. It's an honor to be here. And to your point, after hearing Rupert and Marcos from the official sector and the multilateral or the public sector, I perhaps represent the private sector sort of perspective and see how the state of play, if you will, with regards to the transition finance and where we are at, as well as what can be done further from the private sector perspective in order to accelerate the call from Marcos earlier on. How can we accelerate transition financing, particularly for the emerging markets? I got just a few slides, but let me just be quite succinct given the time. Let me start with the context very briefly. We all know that we need hundreds of trillions of dollars to deliver on net zero transition target globally. but the needs are far more greater for the emerging markets. And you will be hearing me talking a lot about the disparity between emerging markets and the developed economies, because unfortunately in transition finance and climate financing, that is part and parcel of the way that we should find the right solutions for that. So the last few COPs, the COP meetings, rightly signaled a greater focus on financing the net zero transition, especially across, in markets across Africa, Asia, Middle East and Latin America. So those are the emerging markets. And emerging markets are where low carbon financing will have the greatest impact. But there are also profound climate risks that emerging markets are facing, and we are here, we're part of emerging markets. And there's a huge transition challenge in these markets. So the impact, when we talked about $1 of investment of transition finance or climate finance, will be very different depending on where and how that we deploy it. So for example, $1 of transition finance will generate an average CO2 reduction of 7 times more in emerging markets compare if we deploy that $1 in the developed markets. So again, that also goes to show that although emerging markets actually face an enormous challenge from a climate risk itself, the impact of climate risk, as well as the significant need for climate financing, but at the same time, the impact is much bigger for the world. Next slide, please. Next one. Standard Chartered, we issued a study recently called Just in Time, where some of the summary actually of that study that we issue is that we see that emerging markets need to invest an additional $95 trillion, a sum that is higher than annual global GDP, to transition to net zero in time and to meet the long-term global warming target. So in this particular assumption, we assume that the emerging markets will have to achieve the net zero by 2060. Now, this $95 trillion is on top of the capital that is already allocated by emerging market governments or the public sector side under the current climate policies of each respective country. Our financing model would see that the public sector would provide support or grants up to 2060 of a total of about 12 trillion out of the 95 trillion. You can see actually that that's probably a minor portion of the finance needed. The private sector will need to bridge the remaining gap, or the remaining huge gap rather, supplying loans, mobilizing capital and investments with a total of about $83 trillion by 2060 for power sector investments and energy efficiency investments across industry, transports, and buildings and infrastructure. Now, a greater proportion of that big chunk of trillions of dollars for the emerging markets, unfortunately, would have to be needed much earlier on the transition phase. So again, it has to be front-loaded. The key point here is that there is a role, a very significant one, in fact, for the private sector. So banks and other financial institutions have a key role to play in developing and scaling the structures that will channel the trillions required for the net zero transition in emerging markets. Next slide, please. This is a quick look at the progress of sustainable financing in ASEAN. It shows that while it is progressing, I think the growth actually year on year has been on double digit, but it is still very far from what is really needed. So I put the context actually about the 95 trillion, by 2060, this is nowhere near at 82 billion of transition finance market activities, whether that's debt capital markets or debt issuances, whether that the types of sustainability linked loans and transition finance, is nowhere near enough. It's increasing exponentially, but nowhere near enough. And if you look at the chart here, the ASEAN's market activity last year in 2022 only represents 6% of the global sustainable finance market activities. So meaning that the portion, and ASEAN actually stands to actually benefit the most, because there's a greater risk in ASEAN as well because of the climate change. Next slide, please. While ASEAN-specific opportunities, the way the private sector sees it, and I'll give you some proof points, actually why the private sector, global financial institutions of the world actually are actually setting aside to ASEAN with the likes of JETP platforms and supporting the energy transition mechanism country platform. But we see very clearly the significant opportunities in the abundance of opportunities around climate financing across ASEAN countries. You can just Google, actually, you can see many studies or research show a magnitude of opportunities. The issue is that, in ASEAN, but the issue is that all of those opportunities are far greater than the actual sustainable finance activities that has happened in ASEAN. And the power sector obviously represents the biggest opportunity, driven by the increase in energy demand in the future for the ASEAN markets, the renewable energy target mix, and the coal phase out. And that coal early decommissioning is a very important part, particularly for Indonesia and Vietnam. Now, I think the next slide, or this is my last slide, but let me just summarize a few things. How do we accelerate plugging the financing gap from the private sector's perspective? So, number one, I think Marcos is very right. The types of conventional blended finance that we currently have are not adequate to tackle the challenge. We need a different and new innovative financing tools and method that can really attract all this capital coming in from the developed markets into the emerging markets, playing up actually the private sector sort of role in this, because that's actually where the global capital is residing rather than the public sector, but leveraging on the public sector support, such as unfunded guarantees. At the moment, the blended finance that we have, for every 95 cents of unfunded guarantees from the public sector or multilateral development banks, the private sector in average generate $1. So it's almost 1-to-1, which is way, way too low. The leverage should be a whole lot more, perhaps up to 10 and 15 times of that. That's where we can really scale up the financing that is needed to help meeting the net zero transition target. Now, the other part actually that is super clear is that in order to achieve that, new investments or financing structure tools, the overarching enabler would be a super close collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. In this particular case, involving the multilateral development banks with the global capital owners, fund managers, global financial institutions of the world. Now, finding new ways of freeing up capital will mean crowding in investors and leveraging on this multilateral and development bank support. The banking industry here can play a crucial convening role by facilitating that new type of blended finance. Now, we see that platforms, I touched upon very briefly earlier on the Just Energy Transition Partnership, or JETPs. And for ASEAN, I believe it should be something of a significant, sort of strategic importance, because out of the 3 JETP countries in the world right now, 2 are in ASEAN, with Indonesia and Vietnam. Indonesia at $20 billion commitment, and Vietnam at $15.5 billion. So JETP obviously is supported by the G7 along with the multilateral development banks. That's IPG, the International Partnership Group. And the other half is provided by the GFANs, so global banks who are part of GFANs, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, representing the private sector one. But again, the private sector element in this, take for example Indonesia's 20 billion, 10 billion is committed from the public sector, while the other 10 billion coming from GFANs or the private sector, but at a minimum. The intention, of course, is to leverage a whole lot more than just one-to-one. Now, another types of innovative sort of solution, or maybe actually new solutions, is the types of voluntary carbon market. Again, that's another intermediary instrument that I believe countries in ASEAN would have to pursue further from a policy framework perspective and infrastructure to support that. Now, the voluntary carbon market from the forestry and other land use is one thing, but we know that as part of the Indonesia's decarbonization and net zero plan, Indonesia is piloting the work that is currently ongoing to take the energy transition credit or the avoidance carbon credit from early decommissioning of coal-fired power plant into the global stage to become a viable carbon credit that is tradable and attracting investments to come in. So it's not, instead of the forestry and other land use that absorb CO2, this one is from the avoidance side. So these types of instruments actually needs to be encouraged further. The other part actually that we see very important in the market to attract more transition finance is the regulatory landscape. I think Rupert actually touched upon a lot actually on that. From the private sector perspective, we believe that standardization, disclosure requirements that are consistent across the markets are super critical for us in order to avoid the risk of greenwashing or blue washing or red washing. So there's quite a number of colors actually in terms of the washing now. The other thing is that the incentivization framework by the regulators actually would be very much welcome to encourage further flow of investments into the climate space. Whether that's in the form of RWA incentivization or discount, hedging sort of requirements, or any other capital discounting sort of method. We don't, however, believe that punitive or disincentivizing policy would work well. And I believe Rupert may agree actually that it may affect stability of the financial system and creating unintended consequence from a behavioral change and so on of the financial institutions. But incentivizing it actually is probably much better to try to attract more capital to come into emerging markets. Now we see also the need for a very close coordination. And again, I think the Financial Stability Board, the ISSB, as Rupert have highlighted, actually are leading the way to create that sort of common platforms, common standards for what constitute a credible transition plan. We need that. As a global bank, many of the global banks, it's not just Standard Chartered, we have committed to our own net zero as an organization. So for example, in our case, we've committed to be net zero from our own operations. That's from our travels, our buildings, our people, our carbon footprints by 2025. But the more daunting task is that we have also made another commitment on net zero from our financing by 2050, meaning that all the loans, all the lendings, all the financing that we do to every client in the world, in all of our footprints, would have to be measured, and all of them actually would have to amount to net zero at one point. So we just wanted to demonstrate that there is an onus on us to ensure that we are lending responsibly as well. So that standardizations actually would help in channeling that financing. So there's an impetus to do so, but at the same time, that transparency, standardizations, consistencies actually of reportings, disclosures, regulations and policies actually would help to accelerate that. So I think that's how we can put it in. I think I will stop at that, and really looking forward to the discussion. Makania, thank you.
Very well. Thank you very much, Pa Doni. Maybe a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for our panelists. Very important points that's been made from our speakers. But just to put it simply, I'd like to go back to Mr. Thorne to give us a more grounded context on the issue at hand right here. When we talk about, you said that how transition plans are crucial and transition plans requires money. And how do we promote the flow of financing that is aligned with climate change goals and that is also aligned in promoting basically a healthier economic growth for the future. But when we talk about the different circumstances in each country, how do we basically bridge and make sure that the flow of financing keeps flowing, apart from the different standards that are being applied right now? Mr. Thorne, maybe if you can touch a little bit on this subject.
All right, thanks for a very easy question. So actually, I'd like to just remind on the three themes that Governor Perry mentioned in his opening address. I think he put it very clearly. Three themes that need to be addressed: strong political will, a clear framework for the transition agenda, and mobilizing finance. You need all three of these, and each of us in our different capacities have different roles and different expertise to bring to it. So the strong political, to achieve what you suggested, transition finance flows that address the problem at global level, this strong political will is absolutely crucial. And the mobilizing finance, and we've heard from Marcos and from Reno about the perspective from the public and private sector side. From my side of things, the financial stability side, I think we can help to bring this clear framework so people understand the global implications. I think, as Reno said, it's very important that we're not just making sure that individual institutions are saying, I'm okay, my financing plan has me getting to net zero in terms of what I'm going to disclose. Does it all add up to a picture which has the financing flows that are necessary from the advanced economies to the emerging markets, from the public sector leveraging through the private sector to provide those? Do we have those flows? And that's why you need to be able to get comparable, consistent information that you can aggregate to see whether the picture is going to make sense in 2050 or 2060, the types of goals. So this consistent data, I'd just like to come back to it, is a crucial building block, because I sometimes hear people say, well, won't this call for data, it's unreasonable, won't it put emerging markets at a disadvantage? Because they don't have the capacity to provide the data. The advanced economies, they're in a more comfortable position. This is going to show them in a good light, etc. I think we've seen through crises in the past that lack of data or lack of credible data does not protect anyone. I think, this region went through the Asian financial crisis and learned a very good lesson that the credibility of data, providing data in a format that the international community is used to and can compare elsewhere, will actually stand them in a good stead. So I think it's important to build an understanding of the data. It needs to be data that is of a level of detail that is proportionate to the capacity that can be provided. That's a parallel with Basel III disclosure requirements. Not all banks need to provide the same kind of complexity of data, but it needs to be based on the same baseline. So I'm going to plug that aspect of it from my perspective. Others will have other perspectives.
Okay, very well. Mr. Neto, then, do you have any thoughts on this? How far along are we in this transition period? When we talk about the early stages of this transition period, what are the critical factors that should be taken into account when securing or developing a policy framework for sustainable financing?
We are both far along and yet just at the beginning. Because as Rupert said, you need to find a commensurable amount of resources and policy reform that will deliver the Paris Agreement. So we'll deliver 1.5 degrees increase. And as you just seen the IPCC report of last week, we still can achieve, but we have to move much faster in a much larger scale. So yes, we have seen progress. We have seen the growth of sustainable finance. We have seen, ISSB and mandatory regulation comes into places. We have seen progress in data, but it's not enough. And we don't have a lot of time. That's why I say we've got progress, but we're still right at the beginning, simply because what we have is not enough. And we're going to have to find new creative ways to tackle these challenges across the board, from new technologies, new sources of energy, all the way to, as Pacrino mentioned, new financial instruments that can, risk share at a much larger level than we've seen anything so far. While securing financial stability. That's why it's very important to have Rupert here. We don't need to do all those things, but at the same time, maintain that financial stability, which is at risk because of climate, but also needs to be maintained and even enhanced, I would argue, by tackling climate. So I think putting tools, putting policies, and putting finances behind it, it's important. Perhaps the last comment I would make on this question, if you allow me, is to say that the problem here is not a lack of money. The world has plenty of money. There has never been so much money in the world as we have it now. It's just the money doesn't flow to what it needs to flow. And therefore, the role of governments, the role of regulations, the role of central banks to incentivize a kind of changing of the flows of public and private finance, it's essential. Hence, the number one issue the Governor Perry put forward, the political will, is really important, right? Do we have the political will sustained over a period of time, not from an election to another election, to grow up, to scale up, the solutions that we already know that exists? Because we know the solutions. Some of them are here, some are coming, but do we really have the political will? And I think that it becomes an issue that the Secretary General of the United Nations keeps asking all the time about member states. Do we have the political will to reach 1.5, to keep within 1.5 degrees established by the Paris Agreement?
Yes, but how to get there is also, the strategy is also equally important. Mr. Neto, maybe I would like to ask you on early this week, the Sustainable Finance Working Group of the G20 held a meeting in India, and I was just wondering, what are some of the key issues? Are there any concrete actions that has been talked about in these working groups?
Yeah, we are in that moment, for the Indonesian colleagues that remember last year, we're in the moment that we are seeking inputs from several organizations. But we, by June, will provide policy recommendations around three major areas. One, it is this issue of what are the mechanisms of finance that can generate the largest leverage and support the largest leverage. And what is the role of public and multilateral development banks in scaling up those financial mechanisms? So that's one priority. That's why we're talking about risk sharing, de-risking. I think the second priority has to do with, it's a larger than climate. It looks at the entire SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and looks about what are the enabling environment that we need to put in place around data, right? I think we're back at the data here that would allow for finance to flow to sustainable development goals. And the third one, which is an issue that we haven't talked about it, Rupert just mentioned briefly here, which is very important, which is capacity building, right? And especially in emerging market and economies, we need to see a surge on capacity building for government officials, for SMEs, for local companies, so they can fulfill the requests the central bank are putting forward, the disclosures that the ISSB is going to purport. So the India president wants to end up with a technical assistance action plan, primarily towards emerging economies that could see a fast capacity building exercise that would allow our economies to be able to benefit from this transition and to lead the transition to some degree.
Very well. Thank you for that. I'm going to go to Pa Doni to complement the previous remarks. From the side of the private sector, take it into the nitty-gritty detail, basically, on how a bank sees opportunities in sustainable finance. What are some of the assessments that you take into account when you go into specific sectors in financing green projects? What are some of the ongoing projects, or what are some of the sectors that you're looking into right now? And how can people have access to the sort of financing that is available, right?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe there's actually quite a lot of sector that banks would be very interested in investing as part of the transition finance. So whether that's you can cover actually things actually that are under the buckets of, say, JETP, for example. One would be the early decommissioning of coal-fired power plant, investments on the captive and renewable energy value chain, the whole entire chain, grid investments, energy efficiencies, all the way to the EV ecosystem. So it's actually quite a lot of sectors from a sectoral perspective. But I think the key thing, and perhaps actually just to also follow up from what Marcus had said, the political will, as Governor Perry rightly says, is super critical. Actually, that's the main ingredient in order to get all of this collaborative effort to get the public sector, private sector to work really well. But
do you agree the money is available?
The money is there, absolutely. The money is there. The global capital markets actually is there. The problem is that it is not flowing into the emerging markets. Again, that's the classic story. And same thing actually for transition financing. But now actually there is another challenge that, and this is actually first-hand experience. This platform like the Just Energy Transition Partnership, for example, where everybody is being put together, public sector, private sector, multilateral development banks, with a strong intent to develop a model and structure of financing. And to be quite honest, it's not as easy as it sounds. How do you finance early decommissioning of coal-fired power plant? So a coal-fired power plant normally have what, 25, 30 years lifespan, and because it's actually quite heavy investments, you would have to, the payout period is actually quite long. Now, the problem is that the intention is to cut short the revenue generation period from 25 years to, say, 20 years or 15 years. How do you do that? How is it actually that we can make it commercially viable? That's the challenge that we need actually to work together with the public sector to leverage on that types of de-risking mechanism where it can actually sort of refinance the whole thing at a much, much cheaper rate, at a concessional loan rate, if you will, enough to make a difference in terms of the early decommissioning period. So this is just one example that there are things actually, we got our work cut out for us, essentially. I mean, I agree with Marcos, it's nowhere near enough, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of transition finance. But the point is that I think it is really a call for action for everyone. Number one, no one party can do it alone. It has to be very collaborative. Number two, time is running out. It's a call of action actually for everyone to, sort of roll their sleeves actually and put sort of what they can in working actually on this.
And just one last question. What do you think are some of the policies that are needed to make that happen from the private sector perspective?
I think we have touched upon actually a lot on the policy side. I mean that, transparency,
So you support.
standardization, incentivizations, for example, those are the types of policies actually that that would make the market very conducive for the private sector to invest in. Just one last point actually I would like to make. Slightly different topic, but we're talking about transition finance, but that is, and this is not enough, but that whole transition finance within the climate financing framework is part of the mitigation effort. There is one other thing that's probably more immediate, which is the climate adaptation financing, because we are already feeling the impact of climate change right now.
Yeah.
And climate adaptation economy actually will be the buzzword, because it is clear and present danger in front of us. And there's not enough financing. We did a study actually that reviewed asset managers, bankers, fund managers, where the amount of the climate adaptation financing in the world right now is less than 1%. It's less than 0.5% of what is currently needed. So even more dire. So just wanted to put that perspective there.
Yeah.
We want to do mitigation, but equally, I think actually we need to ensure that we have the resiliency in terms of food security, flood resiliency, those types of current sort of issues that we face in adapting our life because of the climate change.
Right. So let's go to the floor. I think I have one question from the audience that I would like to address. I have Muhammad Nuril Hadi from the University of Technology Sumbawa, who's here with us and would like to ask this question to our panel. A voice from the young.
Okay,
The floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity. What we have discussed today is indeed important, but our discussion today strengthened my view on the issue of sustainable development, specifically in the sustainable financing, that this idea of sustainable financing is more like a utopia, which is only good to discuss, but very difficult to implement, as you have mentioned by data and so on. Okay, why? Because it is simply because the idea of green financing or sustainable financing is not aligned with the idea of capitalism. I think that there is a contradictory purpose of capitalism and sustainable financing. In capitalism, the only purpose is to make profit, and on the other hand, on this green financing, the only purpose is to achieve the net zero emission, which is quite contradictory. But Pak Doni has mentioned before that you have experience on financing green projects. I would like to know, based on the experience, do you think that the project are indeed profitable as it was in the conventional business? It will be good if you can share that the profitability in the context of your financial institution and also the context of the business itself. Okay, before you answer, I have the second point of view on this issue. We have abundant evidences about the trade-off between economic development and environmental damage. Governor Perry and Macros have also mentioned that there are a potential slowdown of economic development if we are going to pursue directly to the net zero emission purpose. I think I come from a poor family. We have a lot of poverty in Indonesia, for example. Even without the issue of sustainable development, the poverty is there.
Yep.
And now, when we are going to make the transition to focus on the sustainable development, which have the potential to slow down the economy, how do we face the challenge of poverty alleviation? Well, we have a lot of people still live in poverty. Thank you, Kanya.
Very well, thank you for those important questions. Maybe you would like, maybe I'll go to Pak Neto, Mr. Neto, to answer this last question. Does sustainable development go in line with economic development? Is it going to be a new source of growth for the economy? And that's also an important question that's been in the mind of at least one young people that is in attendance here, Mr. Neto. How do we align it? Is it only, does sustainable development is only good for the planet but is not good for the people? So what is your view on this?
Well, no, it has to be good for the people. You know, we people need to learn to live within the planetary boundaries, but we need to make a good living within the limitations of the planetary boundaries that exist, right? Let me just give you an example. The world is spending trillions of dollars a year on fossil fuel subsidy. Trillions of dollars a year. A lot of those fossil fuel subsidies are not helping poor families access energy. They're actually helping very large companies, right, produce oil and gas. If you were to move those subsidies on fossil fuel to education, to health, to training for a green energy economy, you would have enough money, right, to make sure that the people, right, are having the resources necessary to thrive in the transition, while at the same time, you will be addressing the transition by reducing subsidies to fossil fuel. So there are political and policy choices to be made that will secure the sustainable development, the green economy, while at the same time helping people get out of poverty. And if you don't do that, right, there will be no transition. We all remember when the French government tried to put a tax on fuel, right, in France, right, and a lot of people went dressing yellow to the streets to complain about that. Right, because there was a perception in there that you were trying to achieve a transition on the back of those that were, you know, truckers and part of the economy that was unfair, right? So there will be a backlash. That was back to the transition finance. If we don't understand the unintended consequences and mitigate those unintended consequences, people will go to the streets. And there is no need for that. Sustainable development, the concept of sustainable development was created in 1987. And it is the development of economic, environmental, and social at the same time, not one after the other or in sequence, at the same time. The Sustainable Development Goals of the UN are the clear representation of an attempt to move the world forwards economically, socially, and environmentally at the same time. It can be done.
Very well. Mr. Thorne, I would like your assessment on this. It's just, which is in relation to what the FSB is actually doing. One of the key areas that you are working on is also assessing vulnerabilities, risks, and in relation to climate change. What are you identifying? What are some of the risks that you're identifying with climate change transition?
Yeah, so the risk, and I just emphasize, as I mentioned him, I think, that we're the Financial Stability Board, so we look at financial risk. We don't pretend to be climate scientists or measures of other sorts of risks, but from a financial risk point of view, there are two basic sorts of risks. One are the risks from transition, which exist. There are risks there because there's going to be a reallocation of resources. There's also, which I think is the much bigger concern from a systemic point of view, the risks of a disorderly transition. And that transition, the risks of that are much greater the longer we go before the transition meaningfully starts. And we've heard some of the figures here about how far away we are from the amount of transition financing that needs to take place for an orderly transition. The longer we wait to get that started, the more disorderly that will be, and that will affect capitalists as well as it will affect individual people. It will hurt individual people more, but it will hurt everyone. And I think part of the, I talked in this abstract way about scenario analysis earlier. One of the key aspects of doing this scenario analysis, saying what is the scenario for what the real economy and the financial system will look like in 2030, in 2035, 2040, is to change the mindset that there is no alternative world in which it's not a choice between just the world continuing to grow as it has done over the last 100 years versus making the transition, because the world can't continue to grow in a quality of life sense in that way. The climate degradation, the effects on economies is going to happen. To explain that is the baseline, not a baseline nirvana of the world growing at 3% real GDP forever. To understand that that baseline is a different one, and that baseline is not a very satisfactory one. To change the financial debate there, Marcos mentioned the importance of changing incentives that come from subsidies, that come from tax regimes. That's not really for us, but it is for other people, and it's a very important aspect of it. Nobody lives in a world of pure capitalism. The incentives that are set by the public sector make an enormous difference around the world already, and it's important that they're set in a constructive way for people. So I just make those points, but I think maybe
Pak Doni can add to that. There are some other points on the private sector. The first question was...
very simple. I can assure you that green financing, climate financing, transition financing, that it's not a myth or utopia. I mean, it's really happening. The issue that we talked about was the scale of it, right? I mean, we need a whole lot more than that. I mean, that's the issue. It's not about actually making it happen. And if you ask me, is it commercially viable from a bank sort of perspective, or are they bankable projects? They are. Quite a lot of them. Just take, for example, we are only one bank. Actually, there's so many other banks in Indonesia. And take, for example, closer to home. We financed the largest floating solar panel in Southeast Asia, second largest in the world in Cirata last year. I mean, that was, super green actually, and, renewable energy. Many of the banks actually will help facilitate the government of Indonesia. Ministry of Finance's issuances of green sukuk, for example. I mean, that's very much a commercial instrument, if you will. And many, many more. I mean, there's a lot more actually of case points actually that it is happening, and a lot of financial institutions, investors, asset managers are actually looking into opportunities in this space. Take, for example, the carbon credit. You want to be the next tycoon, I suppose, just put it simply as an anecdotal. In the old days, maybe actually you need to own a coal mine. In the future, you need to own carbon credit project, restore forest. That will bring a lot of money. Look at the carbon credit price actually in the world today, right? Exponential growth, for example. So there's a viability across many of these aspects.
Oh, but when you compare it to conventional banking, is it worth to make that transition?
Absolutely, no doubt. I mean, no doubt, no regret. I think financial institutions, part of GFANs, for example, have committed to the net zero. I mean, we embarked towards this because that is indeed the future, and it's not a philanthropic, sort of drive only, but it is driven actually by also commercial considerations. All the opportunities will be in that space.
at the same time doing good for the planet as well.
That's right.
Okay, very well. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for all the insights and remarks. I think that's all the time that we have. Thank you again for the remarkable discussion. A big round of applause for our speakers. But, you know, I was just, thinking that, yeah, maybe for a lot of us, climate transition is very challenging. It's a very complicated issue. But as was mentioned, during our discussion, opportunities are abound, and not to mention good for the planet. And we are hopeful that mechanism can be adjusted in the form of policies that can be aligned for a just transition for everyone. But the clock is ticking, of course, for all of us to contribute to climate change. So let's hope that they are done sooner rather than later, I guess. And with that, I hand back to the MC.
All right, thank you. Once again, can I hear a round of applause for all the speakers and moderator? Thank you, Bapak, Ibu, Mr. You may return to your seats. I really like the last sentence that Mr. Rino said, that sustainable finance is not a myth, it's not a utopia, it is happening. All right, ladies and gentlemen, just a quick announcement. We serve lunch at Jimbaran Cafe, first floor here at BNDCC. So if you want to have lunch here, you can go straightly to the first floor at Jimbaran Cafe. All right, I guess that's about it. Ladies and gentlemen, now we have reached the end of our seminar for today. We thank you very much for sharing your time with us today. Hopefully, the whole session was very informative for all of you, as it was for all of us here in BNDCC Bali. Allow me, Nadira Titalia, on behalf of Indonesia 2023 ASEAN Chairmanship, to sign off, and we will see you again on another ASEAN event. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Santi Santi Santi. Thank you.